Should I feel guilty when I eat a hamburger? Maybe. Should I feel bad when I drive a car? Maybe. Today's talk: animal rights and environmental duty. Humans give one another this thing called moral status or moral worth. It's not just that you're a sack of meat, you're not just bones and guts and gross things. You have an extra value over, say, a cow. A cow is also a bunch of bones and gross stuff and gooey, whatever. You and I have something distinct, that is, moral standing. But should it be distinct? Are humans alone more than just a sum of our parts? We have legal rights, but more than legal rights, we have moral worth in which obligations are due to us. Even if there aren't laws, we expect people to treat us with respect. We expect people to give us the same liberties that we give them, the same free space to exercise their free will, to make choices and so on. Well, then why not animals? Should we allow animals the same kind of freedoms, liberties, values that you and I have under a larger rubric called moral status? Does the planet deserve moral status like humans? It's important to distinguish that we give things moral standing not necessarily because this entity, this being, serves my purposes, but because I recognize it as maybe it's sentience, it has a certain way of thinking, or its DNA, there's something about its physical form that convinces me it deserves something called moral standing. It's not just that it serves me. It would be weird to say, well, you serve my interests, therefore I give you worth. It's a very selfish or egotistical way of thinking. And that's one of the concerns that so many people have, is that we've thought of the planet and other animals and creatures in a very selfish way. How they serve our ends is how we define them, how they meet our expectations or give us pleasure, whether it means we killing them or whether we aesthetically enjoy looking at them on an open field or something. It's always about what serves our interests. Well, let's try to divorce that. Stop thinking about what serves our inclinations or what meets our sense of worthwhile, and think about the thing in itself. Traditionally, the thing in itself, animals and the planet, have been conceived as just raw resources. It doesn't matter if it's a cow on the field that's breathing and alive. Sure, while it may feel pain, it's still not a sentient thing. It's still not a moral creature. So traditionally, you could do whatever you want with it. Mostly people would think of these things as resources, obviously. It's not something to be dismissed out of hand, because if you have a lot of cattle, well, then that will serve your interests long term. So inasmuch as you care for the cattle, if you're a cattle farmer, it's not because you see this cow as having internal worth intrinsic to itself. You see it as useful or utilitarian to your interests. Okay. Well, can we have both? Can we see our stewardship or care for animals and the planet not only as a reason to give these things moral worth because it serves our interests, but because these beings, these entities, these whatever we want to call them, have worth in their own right, in their own sense of existence, whatever that might be, even if it costs us. Now, so imagine now that taking care of these cattle, you suddenly can't eat these cattle. Maybe there's a weird disease, it comes along and you can't eat these cattle and you can't process them for manufacturing purposes. And while you may it's nice to see them on the field having a good life, it's costing you money every day as a farmer to have them. In that case, when they no longer serve you, are you obligated to get rid of that crop, to impose the death penalty on them and replace that crop with something else that will give you a reward? Or do these things, even when they don't serve you, deserve your respect and care? That we should care for the things that don't feed us, that we should care for the things that don't make us feel good inside. That's very interesting. Why would we give animals moral standing like humans have moral standing? And notice I'm using the word animals in a really broad way. The basics, traditionally speaking, for why something would have moral standing is that it has this property or it has this characteristic. What is it? One of them is having a soul. If we think something has a soul, obviously you can't see a soul. You're not sure if a thing has a soul or not based on scientific research, but you believe it has a soul. The argument, do all dogs go to heaven? Well, I don't have an answer to that. My dog hopes he goes to heaven, I'm sure. Okay, probably not. He has no idea what I'm talking about. But if it has a soul, it deserves some kind of moral worth. And traditionally, with ancient Greece as an example, Aristotle believed that all living things had a soul. An animus, a force, something inside of them that made them living. So if you look outside, you see a thing growing up in your lawn. That thing has a soul because it's alive. A rock, not so much. So, does it have a soul? Another one, can it relate to people? Can it have human-like family relationships or human-like relationships? Is there a dynamic give and take, an exchange of some sort? They don't have to be animals that talk like human beings, but do they relate in some sort of complex way meaningfully, or do they just follow their programming? Are they just these things that do what they're told by nature's command or something? Or do they have free will to interact and relate with people? Do they have choice? If this being, this entity, has choice, well, then it starts to look a lot more like you and I. And when that happens, usually people get a little nervous. If you were to say on the one hand, yes, things that can think and relate, maybe have a soul or not, have moral worth, and this cow can think and relate and make choices, but also I'm hungry, so I'm going to eat this cow. It has moral worth, but I'm going to violate its moral standing by eating it. There's an inherent contradiction. Now, you may be okay with living with that contradiction, but if there is a contradiction there, it has moral worth, but I'm going to use it however I want anyway, morally speaking, that's a problem. For some, however, it's not a conflict, and it doesn't have moral worth because it doesn't really think. It doesn't have a higher order form of thinking or relatability with other creatures, even internal dialogue with itself. It just doesn't have these things. It looks like it's living. It looks like it might have a soul, but it's a fancy organism run by basic natural programming. We may criticize ourselves and say that many of us are like that, but generally speaking, humans are considered exempt from that in our complexity, our ability to think, and so on and so on. Another way to define a thing and its worth in terms of its relatability is to think of the ways in which humans create institutions or arrangements or social contracts in ways that animals do not. We come up with, and maybe this is a negative in your opinion, but we come up with countries, municipalities, states, and we organize schools, and we organize how hospitals work. We have a very complex system that simply doesn't exist in nature. It's something that we generate. And in that creativity, again, you may think that our organizational structures are kind of poor and they need to be revised, and fair enough. But in that creativity of something new, we see something about humans that we don't see with cattle, dogs, fish, birds, and so on. Yes, they relate, and they relate to one another, but they do it in a predictable fashion. For the most part, you don't see a creative adaptation. And when we do see a creative adaptation, I remember seeing for the first time dolphins creating mud storms. The dolphins would swim in a circle, and they would create the sand and the silt would come up in this big, large circle, and it would trap the fish inside. And once the dolphins had worked together in a complex relationship to perform a task, they would then go and eat these fish. Well, when I saw that, I was like, well, there's an example of higher order thinking. But does this constitute the kind of relationship building or social contract that defines human beings? Again, we may argue that those that define human beings are corrupt and so on. That's a different conversation. But some will say, in as much as we see dolphins or elephants or these other, many people agree, more complex animals than, say, hamsters, that's an indication that they're getting closer and closer to this thing that we typify as human. Here's a big one for me. Does this entity think morally? Does this entity care about other entities? That is it asking the question that you and I are asking right now? Because if it's asking questions about how it ought to relate to others, that implies an obligation of some sort, that it can think this way about moral questions, and then it's trying to answer them to live in a better way. Do dolphins sit around deliberating on moral theory on how best to be dolphins? Or do they simply follow their biological imperative, their biological programming? And I'm not saying biological programming is inherently bad, but this is just, and humans have biological programming too, but we're looking for that extra, that different category of existence that gives us standing. Because if we have this thing, then we need to find the creatures that may or may not have it and give it to them too. And this idea of thinking morally may be, again, it's my own personal opinion, one of the most important criteria for having moral standing. But my children don't have this ability. They do to a certain degree. They think about right and wrong. But when they're quite young, they didn't have that ability at all. And yet I gave them moral standing. So what is it about the immature children, human children, that gives them moral standing? Is it the expectation that they will mature and get moral standing? What is it about that we give to children moral standing, but not to animals? We could just say animals are persistently immature because they lack the capabilities of becoming more, but that we still give them moral worth. So it's a bit troubling. Following closely on that, this is probably the second biggest point for me, or question of concern, is the ability to say no. The ability to say no, and as something that gives us moral worth. So again, this deliberation, human beings are trying to figure out, what does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to be good? Animals don't really think like that. There may be examples. I'd be interested to hear about some of the examples that you know of in the comments, but there aren't really a lot of examples of this great, trial and tribulation, trying to figure out existence, trying to be a good person, struggling to do the right thing. We don't really see that in the animal kingdom so much. It's just following the programming. Humans can say no to anything. We can say no to food. We can say no to recreation, wanting to have fun, happiness. We can say no to that. We can say no to our biological imperatives for sex. We can say no to all of these things. Can animals say no to their own drives and instincts? Can a cow say no to its own drives and instincts in a way that serves others? So I'm going to say no to my own drives because I recognize that so here's an example. Let's say we have limited resources for food. I'm going to say no to eating, and I'm going to give it to my children. Why? I want them to survive. It's my moral imperative to make sure that they survive. I'm going to make sure they have food. Do animals do that? And there are examples in which animals will put themselves in jeopardy to protect their young, just like the example I gave now. But large scale, this idea of, can they say no to their drives, or are they fundamentally wired to be this? And realistically, how much do humans really say no to our drives? Realistically now, we may think we're above our drives and our instincts, our urges, but don't we kind of just live our lives trying to satiate them most of the time anyway? So is it a bit of a false dichotomy to say, well, we're reflective, thinking individuals, we're willing to say no, we're willing to sacrifice, and animals aren't thinking or reflecting and they don't sacrifice? It's not entirely clear-cut. Yes, there's definitely a difference there, but maybe there are examples in which animals remind us about a form of justice and fairness that we might not normally think of. Wrapped up in this conversation is a question of, what does it mean to be a self? What does it mean to be a self? And one of the things that humans prize is the ability to make the self, to make choices that shape me in a way that makes me unique from other human beings. So in my case, it was going into philosophy, getting degrees in philosophy and becoming a philosopher and thinking about things. It wasn't an intent to just make myself unique. It was just something that I enjoyed. It made sense to me, and it drew me in as something very engaging. But subsequently, I've become, a little different, a little odd. And then there's the person who drives sports cars, a little different, a little odd, or the person who goes to the Olympics, right? A little different, a little odd. And we're all going these different directions. At the end of the day, we're still following our basic imperatives, but there's that sense of uniqueness or originality that is a product or byproduct of thinking for ourselves, our individuality, that we don't see as much with the animal kingdom. We love our dog, our golden retriever. He has a personality. He has interests. And it's very interesting to watch the animal grow. He's not even a year old yet, and he's changing every day. And what's really interesting is that when we see other golden retrievers, it's shocking how much they're the same, that they have the basic same temperament and the same drives and interests. So as much as we think our dog is an individual and interesting, he's really, in many respects, a carbon copy of his genetics, of the other genetics in the lineage. Are humans like that? The argument is no. So that's one of the things that makes us special. A problem arises when we say that there's something about thinking that makes a being have moral worth. The more complex your thinking, the more original, the more choices you have, free will, the more you deserve moral worth. Obviously, with immature human beings, that's a problem. But what happens when, for example, my son really wanted to get an octopus for our reef tank? It's a 100-gallon reef tank. It's pretty big. He wanted to get an octopus, and my first response was, no, we can't, because they're too smart. And to take a smart animal like an octopus and put him in this reef tank would be torture. A glass box where this thing is constantly trying to think of how to get out of this box and is aware. If you've ever seen an octopus, there's a video out on YouTube where it literally turns the jar lid. They've been put in a jar as an experiment, not harmed in any way, and the octopus quickly figures out how to get out of a jar. Among other things, they do these fantastical things. In other words, some animals are so smart that some people are happy giving them the title sentient, that they're sentient. Obviously a rock, not sentient. A plant? Probably not. But when we start talking about complex behaviors like the dolphins, getting closer. The octopus, oh my gosh, yeah, it looks like they're really pretty smart. Some also see lobsters and crabs as forming or problem solving to a degree that really implies a higher order level of thinking. So if you and I are okay saying we're special because we think, the more we learn about some of these animals, it's starting to look like a lot of them can think to some measurable degree that surprises us. What about this? We ought to take care of animals. We ought to give them moral standing, not because they're thinking, not necessarily because they have complex relationships, not because they have human DNA, not because they're identity forming like you and I, but because they feel pleasure and they feel pain. If something can feel pain, it's incredibly hard to define pain. I can't define pain, but it's something that you and I know when we experience it, when we get a cut, but also emotional pain and psychological pain. If a creature can feel pain, it should have moral standing, according to some. When we begin to think about pleasures and pains, the life of a cow on the field versus that of an octopus or, say, a mosquito, they're living different lives based on pleasure and pain. And realistically, in a way, a mosquito should deserve some sense of moral worth if it can feel pain. Does it feel pain? I have no idea if a mosquito can feel pain. But it becomes very problematic if it can. Because mosquitoes are one of the greatest killers on the planet, spreading malaria and other diseases. And we as humans spend a lot of effort, time, and energy investing in how to kill these things so they stop killing us. But what if they have moral standing? Okay, that's an extreme example, sort of off-the-cuff example. But when we begin to think about pleasure and pain as giving something moral status, a lot of the criticism of this argument is, well, then everything, that a plant might feel some form of plant pain, so we can't eat plants. And if we can't eat plants and we can't eat animals, how are we going to survive? Are we going to eat dirt? Well, then if we start digging up dirt, we might hurt an earthworm, and earthworms might feel some kind of pain. And if earthworms deserve moral status, then as human beings, we can't get food from the earth. We can't get them from animals. We're just going to die if we give everything moral status. I understand that concern. That does seem to be a bit extreme. And it doesn't mean just because something feels pleasure or pain that it has equal worth with humans, but it must deserve consideration. For example, that we don't kill it unless we absolutely have to. If it comes down to this cow or this worm survives or I do, maybe that's the level of moral worth that we can consider at that point. Versus others who just nonchalantly, this herd of buffalo is inconveniencing us. I'm making this up, but they keep trampling, messing up our gardens. We're just going to kill them because we'll just let their bodies rot out in the field. We don't care. They're just ruining our gardens. We're going to kill them. That obviously there's a difference between the two. The conversation about moral worth in animals flows directly in with basically the same conversation as our environmental duty. Because our same duties that we might have to animals may extend to the environment based on how we view the environment. One helpful way of thinking of this is the environment a thing, Or might we conceive of it as many things, many beings in its biological plurality and diversity? To say the environment, it sounds very cold, very sort of fixated. Okay, what is this? It's like a box full of nuts and bolts, the environment. Well, no, the environment is full of all kinds of living creatures doing an impossibly complex arrangement of things, all going about their business in their own way. It includes the octopi and the dolphins and so on. So when we say environment, we're including humans as well. This all-encompassing ecosystem, the ecos, the house, or ecology. So when we're thinking about animal rights, we're also talking about, in many respects, environmental duty. What might these be? Here are some basic terms to get us going. A nature objectivist believes that nature has intrinsic value. Intrinsic. So it's not necessarily something you and I give it. Nature objectivists say that there's this value built in. Value subjectivists believe that value requires an evaluator. So to say that nature has value is only possible if you and I exist, or some other sentient type creature exists, to say this environment has value. Nature objectivists say, no, it doesn't matter whether you exist or not, it has value in and of itself. Now, this is a huge philosophical question. I don't have an answer to this. It's an interesting question, and it's somewhat of an abstract question, whether things have value in themselves, like that box of nuts and bolts. And does nature have something in it, like it's inside the box, called value? How would that make sense? Isn't it human beings who are saying that nature is special, that nature has value? And if humans were gone and nature didn't have value, that is, volcanoes don't respect nature as having value. Plagues, locusts don't respect nature as having value. They're not sitting around. Nature itself isn't sitting around saying, oh, look at the things that have value. That's what human beings do. And it seems like it's kind of caught up in a bit of a circular way of thinking, but it's an interesting conversation to be had. Why do we say something has value when the thing itself isn't saying that, or implying that, or even acting like that in terms of other beings, other creatures? After all, don't animals treat one another in a utilitarian perspective? That is, when they're hungry, they go and eat other creatures, other things. They consume nature. Yes, they seem to be in more of a harmony with nature. We don't see coyotes. Well, in all fairness, some creatures will devastate an ecosystem if they get out of line, if they get out of proportion, the population gets too big. But by and large, we don't really see that happening. Still, why does a thing have value? Is this just something that you and I are making up and confusing everything by doing it? Here's a working definition for environmental ethics. All right, a working definition, so not definitive. Environmental ethics is the investigation of the scope of our duties, responsibilities to non-human entities, beings, or things. Environmental ethics, just like I was talking about with our responsibilities to animals, is this question of what do we owe this other thing, a tree, a pond, the ecosystem as a whole? What do we owe that? Let me give you some isms to help with the conversation. The first one is anthropocentrism. Anthropos for man or human. Anthropocentrism. This is the doctrine that humans alone have value. Only the anthropos, the being, human being, has value. Because we're unique, as we discussed before, we reflect, we have all of these things that we're just different, right? Creative identity formation, whatnot. So the solution to our current environmental crisis is in the ability of humans to fix it, to find new technologies, new sciences, and through reason, which is unique to us, certainly to the degree that we exercise it, through human thought. There's something about, again, this unique thing, human thinking. Through that, we'll save the world. We'll save ourselves. We'll save the environment and all the cute, fluffy animals by thinking. And some will say that's just pure egotism, right? That's just that pure egotistical drive that humans who have caused so many problems with the environment now think because of their unique status, they can solve it. Well, aren't we though? Aren't we cleaning up rivers? Aren't we? We're still, as a general, as a group, there's still many egregious things going on, just terrible things. CO2, we're not stopping it fast enough. We know this. But aren't we doing some pretty amazing things too? Okay, we're generalizing, but through this uniqueness of humanity, we're going to fix everything. By contrast to the human-centric view is this biocentrism. And the biocentrism says a thing has moral worth irregardless of human beings. If human beings just deserted the planet tomorrow, we disappeared completely, things would still have value. A tree will still have the same value on Tuesday as it does on Wednesday when everybody left. Right? It's the same thing. In fact, this leads us down a conversation in which individuals, people, have the same value as trees, if we have value at all, after our destructive activities. That is there a possibility that by being against the biosphere, the biosystem, the biological activity, by being against it, making parking lots, paving this, doing whatever, we pollute the environment. By harming other things with moral status that have value in their own, are we negating our biological standing, our value? And this is a big conversation that comes up. This is a conversation that comes up time and again under the banner of eco-terrorism, where the eco-terrorist, we define that as eco-terrorist, takes out violent retribution against human beings because the perception is they've violated their own moral standing, just like a murderer would violate their moral standing, and the murderer needs to be locked up, or maybe they believe in capital punishment, and the murderer needs to be killed. The biocentrist, it's regardless of humans, there's value in nature. Another argument that comes up fairly often is not that we're just focused on individual species, species that might be going extinct. We're also trying to value biodiversity. That is just the plethora of different kinds of living organisms in any given situation. It's the diversity that should be valued as well. We may lose one here, we may lose one there. When we do, the concern is that we'll suddenly have a slippery slope situation and we're going to lose all kinds of different species and animals and creatures. So it's not that we're valuing one creature like humans above all else at any cost, at any expense, but that we ought to be prizing biodiversity. The value is in maintaining the diversity because the diversity is actually what sustains life. And moreover, we don't know which species might die that will suddenly short-circuit the whole system. It's like a sweater. I haven't worn a sweater like this in years, but they used to have knit sweaters, and if you pull on one thread, the whole sweater would fall apart. Well, we don't know which thread. Maybe it's an elephant, maybe it's a dolphin. We lose one of these species, and it's a linchpin or a link that holds all the other species in harmony. Suddenly, everything's out of whack. We may have already done that for all we know. We're ignorant. In other words, biodiversity draws attention to not just diversity, but our own ignorance of the importance of these creatures in their disharmony, in their war, in their combat with one another. That too may serve a role. Think of it this way. If you've ever been snorkeling or scuba diving and you've seen all kinds of really cool coral in the ocean, there are all kinds of different shapes and sizes. They're not at peace with one another. They're not living some romanticized environmental bliss where everybody's happy. They're at war. There's chemical warfare. Many of them actually have tentacles. Euphyllia have tentacles that will reach out at night to try and kill other things near them. They just want to be left alone. They don't want to dominate and take over the whole reef, although by extension that's typically what would happen. But they want to be left alone. So they're not murderers per se. They're in conflict with one another. So the biodiversity is in many ways not suspended, but encouraged because of conflict. This constant sort of give and take of territory and space and resources. But what about with humans? Aren't we kind of monopolizing the planet in a way? Our biodiversity, we have different colors of skin and different things like that, but what are we really in conflict with, large scale? Other human beings, of course. But what is it in nature that keeps us in check? And if we are the biocentrist view, all equal, we have a problem. We have a problem now. If we're all equal, but humans are somehow, unlike coral and other species, biodiversity, monopolizing the system, growing to the tune of billions and billions, and simply by displacement. We're just displacing other forms of biodiversity just by existing. Consider the environmental impact of that. And what is our duty? And some will argue that we have a duty to stop procreating if we're literally just by having children and growing in bigger cities and bigger towns, displacing biodiversity around us. we need to slow down. Okay, the counter argument to that is, but other animals don't think that way. Nature itself doesn't seem to think that way. So why are we obligated to slow down our reproduction cycle when animals are not, or plants are not, or nature? And it comes back to our previous conversation, because we know. We know what we're doing. We're the thinking creatures. So let's think about it. To answer, why do I have environmental obligations or duties, and why do I have obligations to animals that animals in the environment don't have to me? It may be because I have a unique faculty of being creative, adaptive, reflective, and I can create situations that dolphins cannot. So dolphins can swim around and catch a few fish here and there. You and I can build huge ships with huge nets and take up the whole ocean. Right? So the level of obligation for us to treat other things with dignity and respect scales up exponentially with our abilities to actually affect change and be responsible for them, and also in proportion to our own displacement of biodiversity. What constitutes something as having moral standing? Are we interested in creatures or beings of the planet? Maybe Mother Earth has a soul. Are we going to define value as linked to intelligence and relationships and identity formation, sentience in general? Are we more interested, or equally interested maybe, in this idea of pain or pleasure as giving this thing moral standing that we then need to attend to? And we may not be willing to give, like the biocentrist, equal rights to all living things, but in the very least, we should begin to think about giving things more dignity and worth maybe than we do. And this is reflected in Peter Singer's argument. Other people have made this argument too, that you and I suffer from a speciesism, that we think our values and our interests outweigh everything else. And he compares this to basically racism or sexism. That is this unjustified view that I'm better than you because I'm me. I'm me, so I'm just better than you. And that's not at all obvious that that's how things should be. I totally understand it, right? We always privilege ourselves. We're seeing and we're living through ourselves. So it's natural to privilege us or me. I mean, the reverse could be true too, that many environmentalists see human beings as inherently evil. I mean, I shouldn't say many, but some do, sort of a reverse racism of sorts. Still, the point is, are we biocentrists? Are we person-centrists? Are we suffering from some sort of speciesism, like that racism thing? And what do we do with all this? The big thing for me is realizing that if I ascribe value to the earth and creatures based on my interests and what I get from them, that seems to be a dangerous and slippery slope. My priority, personally speaking, is to find the value in the things themselves, in biodiversity per se, and not necessarily how these things serve me as my first, at least my initial stepping stone into animal rights and duties, obligations in the environment.